welcome to today's video. In today's video I want to talk to you about these two beautiful cameras, the Leica Q2 and the Fuji X100VI. So let's get into it. So I have a pretty small channel, but the few sort of big-ish videos that I've done over the years have mostly been about the Leica Q2 and the Fuji X100VI and comparing the two. And therefore, I guess it's no wonder that a lot of people have recently been asking me on my opinion of whether they should buy a used Leica Q2 or instead get the newly released Fuji X100VI. And since I've been getting so many questions on that topic, I thought, why not simply make a video about it and maybe get in on the hype? So I've been using the Fuji X100VI for about 2 weeks now. But since I've had a few years with previous Fuji X100 line of cameras, so the Fuji X100F and the Fuji X100VI, I am already pretty confident in my opinion about these two cameras. Also, and this should go without saying, but this video is obviously not sponsored. I've bought both of these cameras with my own hard-earned money. Mind you, though, that's not because I'm not open to the idea of being sponsored. I'm very much open to the idea of shilling for a camera company, but nobody has asked me yet. So anyway, I want to start by briefly giving you a bit of background on my camera journey so far. So I started shooting Canon APS-C cameras, and then I made the jump to Fujifilm over half a decade ago. And I started by buying a Fuji X100F, and I absolutely fell in love with that camera. I later on also purchased a Fuji X-T30 and then upgraded to the Fuji X100VI as soon as that was announced. And I've happily used the Fuji X100VI for about 2 years or so, but then I decided to buy a Leica Q2, primarily because I just wanted to know what that camera would be like and what it would be like to basically own Fuji X100VI, but with IBIS and with a full frame sensor and a faster lens. And so yeah, I bought the Leica Q2 and I've been using that camera for over 2 years now. And I actually ended up selling the Fuji X100VI because after I bought the Q2, I pretty much wasn't using the Fujifilm anymore. And since I also upgraded, quote unquote, my interchangeable lens camera to a Sony a7 IV over a year ago, I actually didn't have any Fuji until recently, until I purchased the Fuji X100VI. Overall though, I think it's fair to say that I have a lot of experience using Fuji cameras and the Leica Q2 as well. So again, I'm pretty confident that my opinion on this subject will not change massively as I'm using the Fuji X100VI more. With that out of the way though, let's quickly also talk about why I even bother to compare these two cameras. Well, first of all, obviously, again, as I just told you, a lot of people have been asking me about my opinion on which of these cameras to get. So I guess I'm not the only person in the world who thinks it's fair to compare these two cameras. But on the surface, I get why people think it's nonsense to do so. Because even as a used camera, the Leica Q2 nowadays will most likely cost you at least 3,600 euros, whereas you can buy the Fujifilm X100VI brand new at 1,800 euros. So half the price. Mind you though, right now it's pretty hard to get a Fuji X100VI, but let's put that aside for a second. The Leica Q2 is a great camera, but it was released in 2019, so it is quite old. And the Fujifilm is obviously a very modern camera that has just been released last month. So basically, I guess the question goes back to the age-old question of, should you buy the latest and greatest from yesteryear or sort of a medium-level modern camera? With the price difference out of the way, I also think that these cameras are actually fairly comparable in terms of their overall specs and features. So first of all, obviously, both of these cameras are using a fixed lens. So you cannot change the lens that comes with the camera. In the case of the Leica Q2, that is a 28mm full frame lens. In the case of the Fuji X100VI, that is a 35mm full frame equivalent lens. So meaning that the actual lens on the Fujifilm is a 23mm lens, but since it does have a smaller sensor, it equates to a 35mm lens on a full frame sensor in terms of the field of view that you get. Also, both cameras have a 40-ish megapixel sensor, with the Leica Q2 coming in at 47 megapixels, the Fuji X100VI at 40 megapixels, so they are fairly close. Also, both cameras have a rangefinder style of body, and they do have a fairly similar-ish button layout, at least in regards to the most important buttons to dial in your exposure. Both are also very well built and do have a fairly high degree of weather resistance. That does, however, come with an asterisk for the Fujifilm, because in order to get a good weather seal on the Fujifilm, you do also have to use a filter adapter for the lens. Whereas the Leica Q2 doesn't need anything of the sort. It comes with an IP52 rating straight out of the box, and I've never had any issues using the Leica Q2, even though I've put it through some quite brutal conditions, from freezing cold snowstorms in Iceland to 40 degrees weather in Italy. It's been through it all, and it's worked perfectly fine every step of the way. With that being said though, I've also used previous Fuji X100 line of cameras in rather bad conditions, so out in rainstorms and such, and I've never had any issues with any of those cameras either. Both cameras also are rocking an EVF with a resolution of 3.68 megapixels, and both cameras are obviously very good looking. They also both do have a fairly fast lens, with the Leica Q2 featuring an f1.7 lens and the Fujifilm featuring an f2 lens. Now, you do have to keep in mind that in terms of the bokeh, you have to convert that, so in full frame equivalent terms, that would only be an f3 lens, but we'll come back to that later on in the video. On a slightly different note, neither of these cameras is really a great performer when it comes to high ISO noise performance, but luckily both of these cameras feature in-body image stabilization. So that means that you can go for a slower shutter speed in those low light conditions and use a lower ISO to keep your images a bit cleaner. And also it does mean that you can use these cameras for handheld video shooting without having all of that shakiness in your videos. Talking about video features, both of these cameras shoot 4K 30 in 10-bit, and that is quite nice. But with that being said, the Fujifilm X100VI also does have a few tricks up its sleeve when it comes to the video shooting capabilities, but we'll talk more about that later. And we can obviously not talk about video shooting without mentioning the autofocusing system. And what can I tell you? Both of these have an autofocusing system that works fairly well when it comes to the photography side of things, but both of these are sort of lacking when it comes to shooting video. Now, the Fuji X100VI is certainly better than the Leica Q2 when it comes to the video autofocus. I'd rate the Leica Q2 as barely usable in continuous autofocus in video mode, whereas the Fuji X100VI is probably on the side of decent to maybe good, but it's certainly not up there with other modern cameras like the Sony a7 IV that I'm shooting on right now. Speaking of the autofocusing system, both of these cameras do also have lenses that make quite noticeable noises when using continuous autofocusing. So they are certainly not silent in that regard, and that is also one of the major reasons why I mostly resort to using single autofocusing on both of these cameras. But with that being said, both of these cameras are very silent when it comes to their shutter sound, which is quite pleasant because that means that you don't get noticed, and in many situations that's quite a big advantage. Overall though, I think it's fair to say that these cameras do actually have quite a lot in common, so I think it makes sense to compare the two. Anyway, with the main similarities out of the way, I'd say let's dive into the advantages that the Fujifilm brings to the table. So first of all, the Fujifilm is obviously a lot more compact, especially if you don't have anything screwed through the front element of your lens. But even if you are using an extra filter for that weather resistance and a lens hood, this camera is still a lot more compact with the lens than the Leica Q2, at least in this dimension, because otherwise these are actually fairly close in terms of their overall dimensions. The Fuji X100VI is also a lot cheaper, even though this is a brand new camera, and the Leica Q2 can pretty much only be bought used nowadays. But it's not just the camera itself, it's also the accessories, because if you want to have an extra battery for the Leica Q2, you will have to pay about 130 euros for one of these puppies, whereas you can get a Fujifilm X100VI battery for, I don't know, 60 euros if you go for Fuji's original batteries, but you can also just get like third-party batteries for 10-15 euros or something. So those accessories are a lot cheaper. Also, as I stated earlier, the Fuji does have a much more modern autofocusing system. Again, it's not really the greatest and most modern autofocusing system that's available on the market right now. Something like a modern Sony will still absolutely beat the crap out of the Fuji, but I'd say that it's still a bit faster and more reliable than the autofocusing system on the Leica Q2. With that being said, I honestly never had any problems or issues with either of the two, at least not in photo mode. Again, it's a bit of a different story when it comes to shooting video, but let's talk more about that later on. Now, some might also say that the Fuji X100VI is also better looking than the Leica Q2. And while I do think that that is absolutely debatable, my wife does think so, I'm not quite sure if I do agree myself. We can certainly say that both of these are quite beautiful in their own rights. I think the Fujifilm actually leans a bit more into that modern vintage aesthetic, whereas the Leica Q2 does sort of look old school, but then again, it also looks very modern in some way. It does just have that clean and sort of timeless Leica aesthetic that Leica's going for nowadays, and it's just different. I think the Fujifilm looks more retro. I think the Leica does look a bit more timeless, so choice is yours, I guess. With that being said though, the Fujifilm does certainly get you a lot more attention than the Leica Q2 for whatever reason. I'm always quite surprised by that myself, because whereas I've pretty much never been stopped or approached when I was using my Leica Q2, just yesterday I was stopped and approached twice while I was using the Fuji X100VI. One person thought it was an actual film camera and she was wondering what it is, and the other person was like, oh, is that the new Fuji X100VI? And talked to me about that for a bit. So yeah, just wanted to mention that the Fujifilm does seem to get a bit more attention than the Leica Q2, and you have to decide for yourself if that's a good thing or not. Anyway, another advantage of the Fujifilm is certainly the fact that you can use those film simulations and those JPEG recipes, meaning that the images straight out of camera, even without any editing, really do already look very nice. And that's quite something, because me personally, I do have a bit of a love-hate relationship when it comes to photo editing. It's a bit like sports for me, in the sense that I often dread doing it, but I'm quite happy when I'm done editing a batch of photos and I like seeing the results. Now, I'm not quite sure if that also applies to sports, because I'm not sure if you can actually see any results, but when it comes to editing images, edited images will still, in my opinion, mostly look better than the straight out of camera JPEGs that you get out of the Fuji. But the straight out of camera JPEGs that you get out of the Fuji certainly look a lot better than the straight out of camera JPEGs that you get out of the Leica Q2. And oftentimes, you know, if you're just photographing your day-to-day life, you might not really feel like editing every stupid thing that you've ever shot, but you still want it to look kind of nice in case you're ever looking through those images at a later point in your life. And it also just makes using the camera a bit more fun, I think, because these images with the Fuji look great right the second while you're taking them, whereas with the Leica Q2, they kind of look off most of the time. And so you have to wonder if you've actually taken a decent photo until you get home and until you've had a chance to edit those photos. And only then you find out if you completely messed up the exposure or if you actually got a keeper. So those custom Fujifilm recipes are certainly an advantage in my opinion. Now with the Fujifilm you do also get that tilt screen that allows you to shoot in more creative angles, and that is quite an advantage, and it is also super well implemented and it just blends into the body when you're not using it, unlike something like the tilt screen that you get on the Leica Q3, which just looks absolutely horrible. When it comes to the video shooting capabilities, the Fuji is also capable of shooting 6K video and 4K at 60 frames per second, so that is quite an advantage. But more importantly, in my opinion, the Fujifilm is also capable of shooting in f-log, giving you a lot more dynamic range to work with, whereas the Leica Q2 only has something like a natural profile and you can dial all the contrast and saturation settings down, and since it's using 10-bit files, you can still get somewhat nice results, but me personally, I think the images still look sort of too contrasty. I don't really like the videos that you get out of the Leica Q2, whereas I do really enjoy the videos that I can shoot with the Fuji X100VI. And for me personally, that is actually quite a huge advantage because I shoot a fair amount of video, especially for this YouTube channel, and having a little on-the-go point-and-shoot camera, if you like, that puts out great quality 10-bit f-log video files with a fast f2 35mm full-frame equivalent lens, that's quite something. In terms of the video shooting capabilities, if you put aside the mediocre autofocusing system, I really do like the Fujifilm X100VI. Another small detail that I really enjoy is this little joystick for focusing point selection. Now I mostly use single point autofocusing, and that little joystick just makes adjusting the focusing point so easy. I absolutely love it. On a similar note, I also really do like this quick switch on the side to toggle between single point, continuous and manual autofocusing system. That's great. You don't really get anything of the sort with the Leica Q2. So if you want to switch between single and continuous autofocusing on the Leica Q2, you have to do that in the menu, which is a bit of a pain. But since I'm mostly just using the single autofocusing anyway, that has really not been a big issue for me. But what is actually quite cool with the Leica is that the Leica will automatically switch to manual focus as soon as you start to use the manual focusing ring on the lens of the Q2. Anyway, back to the advantages of the Fujifilm. It does also come with an integrated ND filter, which is much appreciated, especially in brighter conditions. And it also does come with a flash and with that hybrid viewfinder. So that hybrid viewfinder is not only sort of an analog viewfinder, but it also does come with a small screen that pops up in the bottom right corner of the hybrid viewfinder to show you whether or not your subject is in focus. But you can also just switch to a full-on electronic viewfinder that is at least as good as the one on the Leica Q2, at least in terms of brightness and the colors. So you got all of the options and you can decide for yourself if you want to have a more modern feeling camera with the electronic viewfinder or a more analog feel with the analog viewfinder, or just a mix of the two with the analog viewfinder and the small focusing screen. It's just a very unique setup and I absolutely love it to bits. The Leica Q2, on the other hand, for those of you who don't know, just comes with an electronic viewfinder. So it's just a little screen on the back of the camera. It's not an actual viewfinder in the truest sense of the word. But yeah, to be fair though, most people are probably just using the electronic viewfinder on the Fuji X100VI. So while I personally think that the hybrid viewfinder is one of the greatest features of the X100 line of cameras, most people are probably not too fussed about it. Anyway, while we are talking about the usability, the Fujifilm also comes with a few more buttons and dials, and that makes creating custom buttons and functions a lot easier, and that in turn can obviously really improve your workflow. The Fuji also comes with a mic input for better video audio, but sadly only with the 2.5mm jack, not a 3.5mm one. So you do need sort of an adapter or an adapter cable or whatever, but still at least it does come with a mic jack because there is no way to get audio into the Leica Q2. So if you want better audio for the videos on your Leica Q2, you have to record that externally and then sync it in post. So that's another step and a bit inconvenient. Another sort of big thing is that while the Fuji X100VI is a fixed lens camera, you're not really stuck with having just a 35mm lens because there are adapters available from Fuji. So you can get the WCL adapter, which gives you a 28mm full frame equivalent lens, so basically the same as the Leica Q2. And if you have that adapter mounted to your Fuji X100VI, it's also pretty much the same size as the Leica Q2 in terms of how big the lens is. And you also have the option to get a 50mm adapter with the Fujifilm TCL. So you got all of the options, at least in that standard range of focal lengths. And all that, mind you, for fairly little money, because either of those adapters will cost you probably around 250 bucks or so. So even if you buy both, the entire setup, so basically the Fuji X100VI with 3 prime lenses, 28, 35 and 50, full frame equivalent, will cost you only 2.5 grand. That's not too bad. Lastly though, I just think that the Fujifilm is overall just a bit more playful than the Leica Q2, and it's really the little details that matter here. Stuff like the ISO wheel, for example. A few days ago, for whatever reason, I got the idea in my head that I should probably just set the ISO wheel to 400 and then shoot the camera like I'm shooting a film camera with a 400 ISO film in it. You can obviously do that with any camera, and truth be told, that obviously doesn't really give you any advantage even if you do it with whatever camera. But it's just a kind of playful invitation of the camera body that makes you think of that sort of stuff, and that, for whatever reason, just makes shooting photos a bit more interesting and just refreshes your love for photography in a few regards. And even though I've had the Leica Q2 for 2.5 years now, and I surely could have done the same thing with the Leica Q2, I never thought of it, just because of how the camera is designed. So the Fuji really, in my opinion, is a bit more playful, if you like. But anyway, with the advantages of the Fujifilm out of the way, let's quickly talk about the advantages of the Leica when compared to the Fujifilm X100VI. This video is already dragging on a bit, so I'll make it quick. First big advantage is obviously just the fact that the Leica Q2 is a full frame camera. Now it's an older full frame sensor, so again, it's not exactly the latest and greatest when it comes to high ISO noise performance and such, but it's still a full frame sensor, and that does make a difference, especially when you combine it with the fact that it also does have a few more megapixels. Now again, 47 megapixels with the Leica Q2 and 40 with the Fuji X100VI. You won't really notice that big of a difference, if any at all, but there's some there, at least on the spec sheet. But more importantly, if you pair the full frame sensor with that faster lens, because the Leica Q2 comes with an f1.7 lens, and there's no more conversion that needs to be done. It's an f1.7 lens on a full frame sensor, and that's a lot faster than the f2 lens that the Fujifilm comes with, both in terms of low light performance, but also in terms of the amount of bokeh that you can get in your images, so the amount of background blur and subject isolation that you can achieve. And that is really a noticeable difference. And even if you were to crop the images on the Leica Q2 to a 35mm equivalent field of view, so that you get the same type of field of view that you get with the Fujifilm, you would still end up with a 36 megapixel image, so still really close to what the Fujifilm can achieve, but still with a lot more bokeh, because even cropped to 35mm, you would get the equivalent of an f2.1 native full frame prime at 35mm again, whereas, again, as I stated previously, the Fujifilm comes in at an f3 equivalent at 35mm. So again, that certainly makes a difference. Also, I think one of the big advantages, even though I don't use that all of the time, is that focusing manually on the Leica Q2 is a much nicer experience. Even though both of these cameras have focus by wire, the manual focusing system on the Leica Q2 feels a lot more organic, and it feels a lot more analog. Honestly, for the first, I don't know how long, probably a few months or so, I actually thought that the focusing system on the Leica Q2 wasn't focused by wire. It's that good. It really feels like focusing an analog camera. But lastly, and probably the most important difference between the two, at least in my opinion, is that with the Leica, you do get the so-called Leica look. Now, some people say that the Leica look doesn't exist, but I certainly think that it does. And if you are used to seeing Leica images, you will recognize it, or you will recognize the absence of whatever it actually is that makes that Leica look. Now, some people throw around words like micro contrasts and all that. Honestly, I do not have a deeper understanding on a more technical level of what constitutes the Leica look. All I can tell you is that with the Leica and with that f1.7 28mm Sumilox that is on the Leica Q2, the images really pop and they do have sort of that 3D effect. I don't know how else to describe it, but that's just the way it is. And I've taken a few images with the Fuji X100VI, like this shot of a box of apples, and again I sort of just noticed the absence of that 3D look, because I know if I had taken the same photo with my Leica Q2, it would have felt as though you could actually touch and smell those apples. Whereas with the Fuji, I mean, it still looks kind of nice, but also somewhat flat. I don't know how else to describe it. All I can say is that the images out of the Leica Q2, to my eyes, still look a lot better in some way and more three-dimensional than the images out of the Fuji X100VI. So with that out of the way, let's get to the conclusion. And in my opinion, the Fujifilm is actually in many ways the better EDC camera. So the better camera to have with you on a daily basis to just snap photos when you want a bit more quality, or actually quite a lot more quality with your photos than you would get out of something like your iPhone or whatever smartphone it is that you're using. It takes up less space in your bag than the Leica Q2 does. It is also less heavy than the Leica Q2 is. If you were to break it or if it gets stolen, it's not quite as expensive to replace. The struggle there is probably just that you cannot actually get a Fuji X100VI because they are sold out everywhere for months on end. You also have the convenience of getting great images straight out of camera without having to edit them. And also it really just works great as sort of a point and shoot camera. So you can just set everything to auto, be done with it and get great results. But you can also just switch to manual mode and really dial in your settings if you so desire. Also, and that should be pretty obvious, the Fujifilm is also a lot better value, so you get a lot more performance per euro that you spend. But with all of that being said, when it really comes down to it, me personally, I still prefer the Leica Q2. So let me put it to you this way. On a day-to-day basis, I will probably, going forward, mostly just bring the Fuji X100VI with me. It's more convenient, it's lighter, it's smaller, and it puts out great results, and I don't need to edit the photos all of the time. But with that being said, if I were to go on like a bigger holiday or a once-in-a-lifetime trip, I would most likely bring the Leica Q2 instead. Because again, when it comes down to it, I still prefer the images that I get out of the Leica Q2 over the images that I get out of the Fuji X100VI. And I don't know how else to describe it to you other than to say that once I got the Leica Q2, back in the days when I had the Fuji X100V and I stopped using the V, I never once thought that I should have taken the Fuji X100V with me instead of the Leica Q2. But as soon as I had the Fuji X100VI, I was questioning whether I really wanted to take the Fuji with me and not the Q2 instead. So yeah, in conclusion, when it comes down to it, I still prefer the Leica Q2 over the Fuji X100VI, even though it's a lot more convenient in many regards and also a lot more capable in a few areas. The overall quality of the images and the reliability of the Leica Q2 is still where it's at for me. With all that being said, maybe I should just get a Leica Q3 instead, so that I could also shoot videos in log and probably with a better autofocusing system as well and have more dynamic range and so on. And I could probably do that if I were to sell the Leica Q2 and the Fuji X100VI without actually paying any extra money. But with that being said, I'm really sort of emotionally attached to the Leica Q2 now because I've just taken it on so many holidays and vacations and used it on so many occasions. I really don't think that I could ever sell it unless I had to. So I think I will simply stick with the Leica Q2 for now, as well as the Fuji X100VI. I will keep both of these cameras around And yeah, also just as a side note, if money wasn't an object, which it certainly is sadly, but if money wasn't an object, I would love to instead just get a Leica M11 with a couple of M lenses and then a Sony ZV-E1 as a complementary camera to shoot all my videos with. Yeah, but again, that would cost a ton of money and I don't have that sort of money to throw at my camera gear. Anyway, that's it for this video, and also probably one of the last videos that I will make about the Fuji X100VI, because truth be told, I'm getting a bit annoyed by how many videos there are nowadays about the Fuji X100VI. The Fuji X100 cameras have been niche cameras up until fairly recently. Apparently these are now super popular on TikTok and other platforms. And while I think that is nice in some regards, especially for Fujifilm, I also think that the YouTube market for Fujifilm X100 videos is kind of oversaturated right now. And I'm really not willing to just add to the noise. So going forward, there will probably be a lot of videos of me using the Fuji X100VI on many occasions, but probably not many more videos just featuring or reviewing the Fujifilm X100VI. So anyway, with that being said, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and maybe subscribe if you want to see more videos of me using the Leica Q2, the Fuji X100VI, or other cameras and stuff. Anyway, again, that's it. I see you in the next video. Until then, take care. Bye.